Indian Express. I have with me Mr. Chawla, my co-anchor, and Shashi Tharoor, who's diplomat, member of parliament, writes on history better than most historians, speaks on Hinduism better than most Hindutva, so-called Hindutva warriors, and is generally, well, speaks English better than most Englishmen and women. That we all know. But thank you so much for joining us, Shashi.
Thanks for that unusual introduction, Kaveri. Thank you.
But every word is true. So,
Shashi, and he's more liberal than many of the genuine liberals or ingenuine liberals.
Great. So, Shashi, we'll begin with China right away, since that's the topic that we want to focus on initially. Do you think that there's a moment in history right now where India can look at this adversity as an opportunity in terms of its global leadership?
Well, you're jumping a little ahead of the game, because we don't quite know how this present crisis is going to turn out.
Right.
At the moment, I think it's very difficult to feel anything other than that it's been a very major setback for India. We were caught napping by the Chinese adventure in the Galwan Valley and across the LAC. There was clearly some sort of intelligence failure, in that we didn't know what exactly was being prepared by the Chinese. All indications are that the Chinese have made inroads into a number of areas, particularly Pangong Tso, the lake, Galwan Valley, overlooking the very crucial strategic road for us, the DSBO road, DSDBO road as we call it. And then on top of that, there have been other pushes forward of slightly less significance. But what seems to be happening is that the Chinese are indulging in a much bigger game than we in India have woken up to. They seem to be thinking in terms of a long-term future settlement of the border. They've been saying for years, for about 20 years now, that we should leave the border to future generations to settle while we concentrate on expanding trade and economic relations and so on. But the fact is that the future generations may actually have a very different border to settle, because the way things are going, periodically there are little incidents, little encroachments. There's no big war like 62 where they came in big numbers and took over the whole of Aksai Chin. What you've got is little small encroachments. This one went badly wrong because 20 Indians were killed. But the idea seems to be that each time there's a little flashpoint, India will go and try diplomacy, a big announcement of disengagement. But at the end of the disengagement, the Chinese troops are in a better position than before the crisis happened. And the net result is, at the end of a generation's time, another 20, 25 years, we're going to end up with a very different LAC. And then the Chinese will say, okay, let's settle the LAC, we'll keep what we have, you keep what you have, and it'll be a different story. So the Chinese seem to really have a capacity for thinking in the long term, thinking in a very generational way, to use their own word. Whereas we in India, we are a democracy, we are driven at most by the expedient, by the 24/7 news cycle, by how to manage the headlines, by what will sell at the next election. We don't seem to think long term. And therefore, at this moment, before we ask questions about whether this is an opportunity for India, let's face the fact that it has been a very serious setback for India. Now, about the opportunity that exists would be, in theory, the opportunity to rally a resistance to what the Chinese are doing. But that is an opportunity that, again, we stumble against, Kaveri, because of our very long and very committed refusal to get into any alliance relationships. Strategic autonomy has been a buzzword since 1947, but as recently as yesterday, our foreign minister said in a public interaction that India has never been and will never be involved in alliance politics, which means that there are limitations to how far you can go if you don't have allies. If tomorrow there is a joint China-Pakistan pincer attack across the LAC and the LOC, for argument's sake, obviously it's a job of our diplomacy to prevent that. But if it happens, without an alliance, are we equipped and able to cope on our own? The jury is still out. So there are questions like that that really will have to be looked at. So there is a theoretical opportunity, but the building blocks to take advantage of that opportunity have not yet been put in place.
Shashi, you raised this question of alliances and whatnot, because non-aligned policy of Nehruvian model of non-alignment, that seems to be dead. As far as we know, the non-alignment is dead, and you are still pushing for alliances now. Is it strategically desirable for us to join a kind of alliance against China? Or what kind of alliance?
I'm not pushing for it. I'm raising the question, what do we mean in terms of a new opportunity? I'll give you, I have a recent article which argues that we can't afford to join the containment game precisely because we don't like to put all our strategic eggs in any one basket. Therefore, we will never have alliances. That seems to be the taken for granted vision of every policymaker in Delhi, of every party. Therefore, what we have to do is find ways in which, short of alliances, we can create a sort of environment of relationships, a network of partnerships by which we can do something about China. But it can't be the containment game that the US would like us to play, and that would require an alliance we aren't prepared to commit to. So what I've suggested is that instead of containment, we should think of a policy of constraining. Constrain rather than contain. And
no, I'm going into bigger question, because you believe in Nehruvian model of politics and diplomacy so far. What I understand, maybe
for you that's a term of abuse.
The question is, I think now the Nehruvian model, as far as the BJP is concerned, is dead, because they're dead against Nehru, whatever Nehru did or Indira Gandhi did. But I think the South Bloc is still dominated by Nehruvian way of thinking. They look at the wall and see Nehru and they start thinking like that. What came yesterday, it reflects the Nehruvian way of thinking, that we will not be aligned with anybody. But do you think now Nehruvian model is obsolete? It has to be relooked as a diplomatic?
Look, Nehru himself was an incredibly intelligent and flexible figure who would have evolved with the times. It's just that the poor man passed away 56 years ago. So we keep talking about an old model. I think he himself would not follow the rules that he drew up in an era which was very different from today's era. So clearly Indian foreign policy has evolved and must evolve. As far as I'm concerned, there's no real contradiction of Nehruji in saying that. He took a certain approach that he judged to be right for his time and for the circumstances of the world at that period. And today the circumstances are very different. Though paradoxically, the unipolar moment that seemed to discredit non-alignment, the period when there weren't two superpowers not to be aligned between, that period is disappearing. And because the Chinese are rising up very much as a superpower, they are going to overtake the US in purchasing power parity terms imminently. And in absolute dollar terms, they will overtake the US well before the midpoint of the century. So there will be two major superpowers, but there are major differences. And I think, again, the template of the Nehruvian era won't exactly apply because, for example, the US and the Soviet Union were two superpowers that had nothing to do with each other. There were no economic relations. There was no mutual investments. There were no cultural exchanges. There were no Russian students in American universities or American students in Russian universities, or businessmen or tourists or whatever. And so it was a very different era from the US-China Cold War that people are talking about, because the Chinese own more American treasury bonds than America does. The Americans have more investment in China than the Chinese do. Both countries have massive, China has more students in American universities than India does. America has more students in China than any foreign nationality, etc., businessmen, tourists, all of that. I think very clearly it's a very different template from what we saw.
Shashi, there is some kind of a similarity between what happened during Nehru time and what is happening in Modi's time. Both of them, I think, trusted Chinese much more than what they should have been trusted. Don't you agree on that? Then Nehru almost Hindi Chini bye-bye, and after that in 1962 happened. And Modi met the Chinese leader 18 times in the last 6 years, and what we got in terms of that.
And we got the spirit, instead of the spirit
so
of
Chinese
Wuhan,
can't be trusted, no?
Instead of the spirit of Wuhan, which the Modi people were hailing, we ended up with the virus of Wuhan. And
you have to remember the Hindi Chini bye-bye slogan as well, Panchashila also.
So now we're saying Hindi Chini bye-bye.
Bye-bye. So it means both the leaders did not find Chinese correctly. They did not study. They depended on bureaucrats.
Actually,
Civil servants, diplomats let them down.
No, I agree, but in defense of both leaders, let me say there were objective reasons for a Hindi Chini Bhai Bhai policy. Not just then, but also now. Number one, that in theory, two Asian civilizations with a great deal of history and culture in common could have made common cause different from the rest of the world. Number two, India and China had historically, until 62, never had a war with each other. We had always had peaceful relationship, or at least no negative in the relationship. And number three, we had actually an ancient history of everything from educational exchanges, Chinese students coming to Nalanda and Takshashila and so on, as well as cultural exchanges. The Silk Route meant that Chinese goods came through India. They picked up Indian goods and sold them elsewhere. In Kerala, to this day, we have the Chinese fishing nets because of the maritime Silk Route laid by Admiral Zheng He in the late 15th century. And so you're talking about a situation where there have been benign contacts for so many thousands of years that it was not unreasonable to argue that the benign relationship could continue. But I think in the relationship of today's world, it's a very different situation. First of all, China is, though it pretends otherwise, is a relatively expansionist power. Whether it's the 9-dash line in the South China Sea, the territorial claims against the Japanese islands, against the Vietnamese coral reefs, whether it's against us on the border, whether now it's against Bhutan. The Chinese really like to, stretch their elbows a little bit at the expense of others. Secondly, the Chinese notion of a middle kingdom was when their knowledge of geography was also a little limited. Now they can see the whole world, and they do see themselves at the center of a much larger world, and therefore...
Shashi, they're following their ideological line, no? Because communism doesn't believe in any geographical boundaries anyway.
And then ideology has also come in, and their ideology is hostile to ours. So all of these things, I mean, it's curious. I never took seriously Huntington's argument about a clash of civilizations.
Yeah.
Because I argued that no civilization is monolithic, and therefore, these things don't simply clash. But there is something about the way in which Chinese civilization is manifesting itself today, ideologically, geopolitically, militarily, everything, that is going to, I think, bring itself to clash with others, and that's something we'll have to take very seriously. Now, having said this, what is the opportunity that Kaveri wants me to highlight? I would say the opportunity could be if India were to lead or at least catalyze a group of countries that could form a partnership, not an alliance, since New Delhi doesn't believe in alliances, that would help constrain China. I've mentioned, for example, that in addition to Australia, Japan, which we've talked about in the past, there's common cause we can make with Indonesia, with Singapore, with South Korea, all of which also don't want to be in a containment alliance against China and can't be, but which are very worried about China. So when we talk about a constrainment policy, what we're talking about is, you see, containment is a hostile action. You're saying we will restrict China's rise, we'll push back against it, we'll be inimical to it. A constraining says, no, let China rise if they want to, let's trade with China, let's do everything, but let us collectively leverage our strengths to limit how much they can do, how much damage they can do to us and to the rest of the world. And that, I think, is something we could see as an opportunity. I don't know how our friends in the foreign ministry will think about this, and I certainly will intend to engage with my friend, the foreign minister, on this subject. But I would say that at an intellectual level aside, the government of India has to think very seriously about how much it's prepared to expend in focusing on these matters. Why was there an intelligence lapse? Had we taken our eye off the ball? Or was it simply that we never saw China as likely to do this? Were we too enamored by the idea of Chinese trade and Chinese investment in Chinese apps? And there, Prabhu, I would say that there is a difference between the Modi government and previous governments. As late as UPA 2, there were restrictions on what China could invest in India that were lifted by the Modi government. The restrictions on Chinese investment in the power sector, in the port sector, and in the telecom sector that were lifted by the Modi government mean that China is very heavily implicated in sectors that are sensitive for India if we are talking about a potential hostile military situation. And we will now have to undo some of that. So now we block these Chinese apps. Tomorrow, the telecoms department will have to examine whether Huawei and ZTE, which are two of the 5 companies bidding for the nation's 5G contracts, should be allowed to continue to bid.
But they are cancelling. Sashi, they are cancelling some of the projects they had undertaken earlier. You can see the reversal of real policies. You are right that there was liberalization, and you opened up the economy. You did it in 91. You started slowly. There were certain bans, but after that, it started opening up. It is a process that started by Narasimha Rao government, which everybody followed. Like the foreign policy. Foreign policy was followed by all the successive prime ministers and every party. Now, as I said, so it is happening. Yes. The question is, we have been betrayed many times by Chinese. Their interest is both not in terms of geography only, but also economics as well, as you rightly pointed out. So, because it's a political leadership on both sides which has failed the nation.
Right. I mean, okay. Let's say that still this is an evolving situation. When I challenge my friends in the government, they tell me, listen, it's not over yet. Disengagement is still happening. We're still talking. Don't write us off. Meanwhile, my party, I think understandably, feels that there has been a very major setback that the government is unwilling to acknowledge. And the government cannot pull its wool over the eyes of the Indian media and expect the Indian public to be fobbed off. I think we have to now face up and look at the realities. So let's see. If it's an ongoing process, let us see if we can restore the status quo ante. That will be the acid test. If Chinese troops, including in Pangong So, in Galwan Valley, in Depsan, in all the areas where they have made advances in May and June and July, if they will actually go back to their April positions, then we can say to the government, you've achieved something. But even then, I would be vigilant. Because
Shashi, you are referring to, Shashi, you are again referring to this encroachment of coming on our side of India. Prime Minister is on record saying that they never came this side, they never came to our side. How do you refute that kind of thing when the Prime Minister...
I think it's very, very disappointing, the Prime Minister's statement, because the immediate reaction was, if the Chinese were not in territory we consider to be ours, why did 20 of our brave Jawans die? Where did they die? They died asking the Chinese to vacate territory they considered not to be Chinese. Now, the technical explanation, if you want, Prabhu, is that the Chinese have claimed a certain idea of the LAC up to which they patrol, and we have claimed a certain idea of the LAC up to which we patrol, and there is a certain area of overlap almost in multiple sections of the LAC. That is that where we think it's our territory and they think their territory, there are areas where both countries consider.
That means the buffer zone, you're talking about the buffer zone.
There isn't a buffer zone. Literally, the Chinese are patrolling in areas today that we are patrolling tomorrow. That was the situation. But in these areas...
It's like Pakistan, when all of you congressmen claim that they never went there and had blown up the terrorist camp there. Until today, we are still listening that, okay, you have no evidence, and that the Prime Minister was right at that time.
No.
When I'm saying when the Prime Minister says we have to give a counter argument or picture, visual, something.
I'm giving
you. You're assuming, yes, I agree with you. You are assuming that, okay, because where did they fight? Did they fight in their territory or our territory? That's the question irrelevant.
Prabhu, they have not only fought, they have established durable structures in territory that we have historically claimed to be ours. Now, when you say that they have not come to Indian territory, you are essentially conceding a Chinese point. If you look at places where the Indian military has historically patrolled, historically meaning up to April of 2020, they have been patrolling. Now, the thing is that there was a very good modus vivendi for many years. I mean, frankly, I've received briefings on all this when I was minister in the External Affairs Ministry. So I'm not telling you something which is not official Government of India policy. And the official understanding is, listen, there are different perceptions of the LAC, but we have worked out a very healthy relationship with the Chinese. We will patrol in the area we believe to be ours on Monday. The Chinese will patrol there on Tuesday. As long as we talk to each other and we understand what we're doing and we don't actually fire at each other, we'll manage like this until one day the diplomats settle the border. That was the basic way it was functioning. So every once in a while, when the guys got the dates wrong and they both showed up in the same place at the same time, and you have been in magazines that I have read where you have published articles saying standoff between India and China, soldiers pointing guns at each other. These things have happened, but they've always been diffused, and people have gone back to their understanding. What is happening under Xi Jinping since 2014 is very different. The Chinese are actually moving to what they claim to be the LAC and staying put. In fact, the first major such incident happened when Xi Jinping was visiting Ahmedabad. You remember this in 2014.
Yeah.
When they actually pitched tents, it was not concrete bunkers, but they or containers, they pitched tents. And it was a huge embarrassment. It completely screwed up the visit. And the Chinese were grossly embarrassed. In fact, many China watchers assumed that Xi Jinping had not yet established control over the PLA, and that's why it was happening.
Yeah.
I think what we're now realizing with hindsight is a policy he had approved took place on a timing he had not approved, and that's what had happened. So now what has happened is, you can see from Doklam in 2017, what happened in Doklam. Now, if the camera is catching this is the Doklam Plateau, right? Now, the Chinese started building a road here. Here is Sikkim. Our guys saw it, and they came down on the basis of the Indo-Bhutan Treaty, and they said, you can't build a road here. Stop. And the Chinese stopped for 72 days. There was a standoff. And then, in what was hailed as a great triumph of Modi diplomacy, the Chinese withdrew from here, right? That's what happened. True. But what did the Chinese do? They went this way, and they built a road, helipads, bunkers, permanent installations, and they've come exactly where we don't want them to come, which is the heights overlooking the Chicken's Neck that connects West Bengal to the northeast. Now, the Chinese, in other words, are constantly taking strategic advantage, and all that the Indian government has been doing is claiming PR advantage, saying nothing has happened. See, we had a big triumph, the Chinese are pulled out of here. But the Chinese have accomplished exactly the same strategic objective in a different route, and a more complicated, perhaps for them, a more troublesome and expensive route, but they've done it. So where do we stand in India tomorrow? If there is a war, they can interdict and shell the roads connecting West Bengal to the northeast and interrupt our supply lines. Now, my concern about all of this is, as an Indian, and I'm a patriot, not a chauvinist, I would say that the government really needs to wake up and smell the coffee, rather than merely saying that if you manage a compliant media and say, no, nothing has happened in Indian territory, I am telling you, the Chinese didn't come here. The Indian media should be asking questions. We are seeing one or two brave journalists raising these questions with photographs. Thank God for Google Earth, because you can get satellite pictures of showing April and showing today and showing the difference. There are some very serious differences in terms of installations the Chinese have installed. So if India manages to restore the status quo ante, I will say, personally, I will say hats off to Modi and his government's diplomacy. Until that happens, the best we can say for the government is they're still negotiating. But at the moment, they've suffered a setback, and let's not pretend otherwise.
Talking about leadership, Shashi, how do you think that this government has handled the pandemic? Has it again been more PR than actual gains on the ground? Do you think it could have done better?
At the national level, first of all, I was one of those who called for a lockdown. I called for it earlier than Mr. Modi implemented it. So I cannot criticize the decision to have a lockdown.
Right.
But I will criticize the fact that the lockdown was given at such absurdly short notice.
Yeah.
Many of you will remember that the government actually gave us 72 hours to have a Janta curfew on a Sunday. So we had that much of notice for a one-day curfew on a Sunday when many of us are relaxing at home anyway. And it was a success until 5 o'clock. Idiots came out and started marching in the streets, banging drums and thalis, and that became a disaster. But apart from that, actually the Janta curfew worked because people had time to plan for it and organize the day so they could do it. Unfortunately, 2 days later, we were given 3.5 hours notice, or 3 3/4 hours notice for what became in the end a 4-month lockdown.
Exactly.
Or it was announced as a 21-day lockdown. Now, no one could plan for that. When you are saying that literally as of midnight, there will be no planes, no trains, no interstate buses, highways will be closed, you stay at home, people were completely caught. I mean, there were people in all sorts of difficult situations, people visiting relatives or friends, people on business trips, migrant workers stuck in other states far away from their families, employers with employees in various multiple locations, all sorts of crises that no one could plan for. You'd given them the same 72 hours, or ideally given them 4 days, and you had kept flights and planes and trains and buses running. people would have been able to take care of their personal plans and you wouldn't have had the crisis of migrant workers that followed. And the huge crisis that also continued for weeks on end. As an MP, I literally got tens of thousands of representations from people stranded in other states, in other countries, desperate humanitarian situations, all sorts of problems that could have been avoided with something as basic as a decent notice period. And we would have thought that Prime Minister Modi had understood the value of a notice period from the Janta curfew experience.
Or from demonetization. I mean, the
demonetization showed that he actually likes shock and awe.
Yes.
That the shock and awe method that he prefers, that the American generals boast about, this seems to be his preferred style.
Shashi, I don't want to go back into the demonetization, but I'll discuss the pandemic with you. Whatever it did, rightly or wrongly, what do you think? It has been a success or a failure in terms of numbers?
I would say
in terms of numbers, as of now, ultimately we are interested in the result.
Yeah, so sadly, I would
your own Kerala government was lauded by all the liberals and people like me.
But no more.
After that, no more. It means all the figures which were being given to us, they were being filed by PR agency and we are accepting them. And I was the first person to raise the numbers question with the minister.
And that's exactly what applies nationally as well. Number one, we didn't use the lockdown period well because of lack of planning. Number two, we didn't use it, unfortunately, to strengthen our capacity to cope with the inevitable. Because lockdown was unplanned and people were not able to go home and so on, you ended up in a situation where the spread took place before the remigrations, and now it's spread all over the country. There was a time as late as June when a majority of the districts of India had no reported cases.
Yes.
Today, there's a very, very tiny number of districts without reported cases. Secondly, and even more troublingly, the numbers keep shooting up. And you've seen the seropositive study of Delhi yesterday, which came up with the startling finding that 1 out of every 4 Delhiites has this virus.
Right.
1 out of every 4. I mean, we're talking about 45
Shashi,
lakh people.
I am going to interrupt you here again. That's how the figures are being played out by the people who are trying to promote the pandemic rather than promoting the remedies. Because when you say 25% people are supposed to be positive, we have done the test in our own office. Out of that, only 7 people were found that there. And all the 7 later on were tested negative. That means recovery rate was so high. Even though I assume 25% people of Delhi are pandemic. Total number of active cases in Delhi as of now at 27,000.
I'm not promoting the pandemic. I'm just promoting.
No, you are trying to highlight the figure because I am trying to scare being created by vested interest by raising the numbers of even people who have been cured. Why you are adding on the number? Do you today tell me that how many people are affected by cancer today? Cumulative total in India? There is a figure in Delhi. I am quoting the newspaper and official figure that number of deaths during the month of June was 5,690, less than the same month last year.
Of cancer?
Yeah, no, total. Total number of deaths registered in the month of June in Delhi was 5,690 less than the last year.
Very good.
So what do you want to say? Who died? Where died? 2,300 people have died in Delhi. These are figures. When you are talking about 1 crore people, how many people are there? 3,58,000 active cases in Delhi. Let me complete one question for you. One question for you. When in a country of 1.25, 3 billion people, only less than 4 lakh people are active positive cases. And mortality is less than 3%. And still we are trying to say states are, and out of those, all the cases, 80% of them are in 10 states. It means rest of the country is immune. You give some credit to Indians. I'm not giving credit to any government. I'm giving credit to the Indians who can fight these battles because they know how to clean the house, because we have been taught in the beginning, when you eat in South India particularly, you have to keep your shoes out, you have to wash your hands. This is what you should be doing. So this pandemic has become some kind of a figure for multinational ability to promote 1 crore people, 1 crore, 20 crore people, 20 lakh people, 25%. Out of 25%, 92% survived. Why don't you highlight that?
No, you made very, very important points, but those were not contradicting what I was saying. All I was saying was, before I was interrupted, that the numbers are uncertain. We don't even really know how many people are carrying the infection. If the Delhi let me finish. If the Delhi seropositive test is accurate, then a very large number of Indians have been hit by the infection. I didn't say anything about deaths and mortality. That's your point. This would argue that the mortality rate is even better because it's lower. In other words, you're saying X thousand people have died out of 11 lakh cases the government is acknowledging. But if the reality is that it's actually 1 crore cases and still only X thousand people have died, that means that the percentage, the mortality percentage is even better. So I'm not denying that. I'm saying that we have difficulties in judging how effective our government action has been because we still do not have reliable numbers for people affected. We still don't have effective studies. I'll give you one example. Do you remember reading about the theory that those people and those countries where the BCG vaccine is administered routinely to infants have a much lower infection rate than countries without the BCG vaccine? Many of the developed countries where there was no TB, no malaria and so on, they stopped doing the BCG vaccine. Countries like India did. And the very interesting case study was of 2 neighboring countries in Europe, Portugal and Spain. Portugal never stopped doing the BCG vaccine. Spain stopped. Spain had a colossal number of cases. Portugal had practically none. So from that, there was an extrapolation. But so far, no scientific study has been able to validate this theory. So we are actually trying to, repair an engine on a moving train. That's our challenge. We don't really know. We don't really know, since we haven't got any definitive conclusions on any of these issues, on the numbers, on immunity, on what causes immunity, on what public policy should be different, even on lockdown. I mean, for example, on lockdown now, there is a whole school of thought that says lockdowns do more harm than good. The Rajiv Bajaj line, we flatten the wrong curve. We flatten the curve of economic growth.
Trump line is also that.
we flatten the curve of the economy and not the curve of the pandemic. Therefore, there is a theory that says, hey, everybody should wear a mask because the transmission takes place through droplets when people sneeze or cough. So those who have the illness should wear masks. Those who don't have the illness should wear masks. That will limit transmission, but don't worry about lockdown. So even that, there is no global consensus on. Prabhu and Kaveri, you are asking a fundamental question on which the judgment will really have to be withheld until the whole situation is settled. Having said that, it is difficult to escape the conclusion so far, and I say advisedly so far, that the performance of the government has been a mixed performance because of the evident lack of planning, the lack of notice, the lack of personal protective equipment for doctors. Many doctors in many parts of India are still complaining they don't have enough gowns and masks and gloves and basic things like that. The inadequate preparations in terms of hospital beds. Now we're converting stadiums and all sorts of places as COVID treatment centers. And at the same time, the general presentational confusion on the part of the government saying there is no community transmission. Last sentence. No community transmission. Now, this is an absurd proposition for the government to keep insisting, because what we're talking about between 2 kinds of transmission is, number one, if you get somebody who has come from an external source with the infection, he meets you, you catch the infection, that is not community transmission. But if you get the illness without having met anybody who has come with COVID from outside the country or outside the state, that is community, that is local transmission, if you don't want to call it community transmission. The Amitabh Bachchan family has clearly got local transmission. They did in lockdown for the last 3 months.
He was on the ads every day, how to prevent it, and he himself got it. But I'm coming to a different just a minute, Kaveri, because he's talking about jury is still out. I agree with you, we don't know what to say. But I will give you another figure now, because I'm talking now, you are talking infrastructure not created. Look at the infrastructure in Delhi. Kejriwal himself held a press conference. There 57% or 67% of the beds are still vacant. In Delhi alone, I won't name the hospital because that will become a very problematic for both the parties. It is huge beds lying there, and there are only 258 patients, and you could accommodate more than 5,000 people there. So there, in terms of total capacity creation, it's been created in various, where you find the headlines, where you find something ahead. You don't go to Bihar, you don't go to Odisha, you don't go to anywhere else. So there is excess capacity in certain areas, and certain Western business interests are also involved. But in terms of infrastructure, it has been created too much in certain areas and very little in other areas.
Well said. That's a genuine case, because I also get reports from places like Bihar and elsewhere, where not only has it not been created, but where what has been created is pathetic. You know, a COVID isolation facility with just 2 stinky toilets and not adequate, no cleaners, all sorts of things. And people are expected to go and lock themselves there for 14 days. There are sort of people rebelling in many parts about these inadequate facilities. But fortunately, most infected COVID patients can cure themselves at home. That's another interesting thing about this virus. It's a very, very small percentage of people who actually need hospitalization.
Right.
And sadly, many of those may actually be at risk of their lives. The sad thing about COVID is no one knows who gets a strain of the virus that could kill you. And when Prabhu, you say that, you know, there is this panic being created, the panic, I think, is because this virus, you know, the classic flu, all of us know that in pure numbers, the classic flu kills as many people every year as any major illness. But since most of us know that we will survive a flu, we have learned to live with it and we try and avoid it, of course.
Let us move to little, Shashi, move it to little politics, also current
In
politics.
fact,
Exactly.
Mr.
Let
Chawla,
me complete.
no, because
sentence.
he talked about a moving train. I wanted to remind him
I'm coming back to that.
that
I
the
must only,
Congress is
in terms of
heading-
masks and whatnot, Shashi, you must know, I have done some studies. I think the variety of masks and the quality of masks, it has become a fashion statement. And there are more variety of masks than the number of actual patients in the country. Everybody is saying my mask is better than your mask. Anyway, very good, please.
No, I just wanted to remind him. He just talked about trying to fix a moving train. I wanted to remind him that the Congress seems to be headed towards a train wreck. So, what are his thoughts on that? People seem to be deserting you. Stalwart leaders, young leaders, promising leaders. How do you handle that?
No, I think that you are overgeneralizing from a couple of cases in which the circumstances were very specific to those individuals and those situations. I don't say this purely in a defensive way, because the honest truth is that all of us want to see a reformed and revived Congress party. But I would say that to derive sweeping conclusions from essentially 2 individual cases, you're talking about Scindia, who has left, and Sachin, who has not yet left.
Yeah.
And we hope still will not leave. But factors relevant only to their particular circumstances may have been dominant. There is no pandemic of disenchantment sweeping the party. But many of us feel that there is a need for us to revive the party with some energy, some fresh blood, some collegiality and consultation, some mechanisms to renew, bring younger people up, all of these things.
But Shashi, you've made so many attempts. You've had the Professionals Congress. You know, you've tried your own bit. Yet we can't seem to get away from this secret list that the BJP has, where you're always top of it on people most likely to leave the Congress for the BJP.
No. I think that's only...
You're always top of the list.
That's only those who have not read me. I think those who have read my writings for 30 years know, and I know Prabhu is one of them. He knows well because I used to write for him and he was editing the Express. That my beliefs, my ideology has always been that of an inclusive and progressive politics, liberal and centrist in its orientation, committed to social justice and individual freedoms, patriotic definitely, but in its determination to protect both national security and human security. And all of this, I believe, still has a great appeal to a large section of the population. I know that the vehicle to transmit this ideology has to also be capable of winning enough votes to form the government. And in 2 elections, we have been found wanting. That's why we talk about needing to reform and revive, but it's not the ideology or the principle. So because the BJP has in many respects a very different ideology, I couldn't possibly make common cause with them. That's the simple thinking. And I think they've realized it. There was some, particularly, I think in a certain period, in the first term of the BJP, who nurtured certain delusions, but it was really never on the cards. So I think you can worry about that. You can stop worrying about that, but worry about the larger question you asked. I would say that I hope Sachin doesn't leave. I think Scindia's circumstances were particularly special to Scindia and to Madhya Pradesh in that particular context. And I think that in many places, not only is the Congress the only alternative, there are people saying that we need to move away from the regional parties we've supported in order to support a national alternative, because clearly the regional parties are not going to be able to stand up against the might of the BJP alone. Of course, where we can make common cause with regional parties, we should. We're doing so in Bihar in the forthcoming elections. But at the same time, we represent a certain alternative vision of India to the BJP's vision, which I believe will continue to attract a lot of people, and certainly to my knowledge, and certainly in my state, still has a pretty strong following.
Shashi, are you saying that you should Ikla Chalo policy that was evolved about 20 years ago?
No, I'm saying that there are places where we will be alone. We really are the only game in town in Madhya Pradesh, in Rajasthan, in Punjab, certainly. But in places like Bihar, arguably in UP, though that the jury is still out on that also, there are very strong regional parties, clearly in Bengal, Tamil Nadu. There are places where a Congress alone scenario would be unwise politically. So I think that I would leave it to the party leadership to determine where to take the Akla Cholore policy and where to take the... but you know, my larger argument actually, both within the party and in terms of alliances, goes back to Rahul Gandhi's forgotten slogan of the 2014 election campaign, which was "Main nahi hum." And I think we forget this, you know, whereas BJP offers you one-man leadership, one-man rule, hero on the white stallion with upraised sword saying, I know all the answers, I'll solve all the problems, I'll cut through all the Gordian knots. Congress is saying, listen, we're giving you an entire team of experienced, qualified, competent people working with the leadership to produce results for this country. And similarly, when it comes
Shashi, you can claim that, but people don't believe that they think you also got one person. I'm talking about the pandemic which has hit the Congress party.
Can you imagine Modi saying, can you imagine Modi saying,
no, I'm coming back to that. He doesn't say he doesn't believe it, but you say it, but you don't believe it either. Because for 22 years, you have only Gandhi as a party president, and party has been thinking then. Since then, 98 she took over, and you are in 2020. Still, she is the working, not temporary arrangement for 22 years only between Gandhis only. But I'm saying, talking for Arunachal Pradesh, your political pandemic started. It is still there in Rajasthan. You have not been able to find any political vaccine to stop it.
Look,
you have the Gandhi, nobody else. And that vaccine is not working.
I think the Nehru-Gandhi family undoubtedly holds a special place in the hearts of most Congress party members, and I would argue with good reason too. Because aside from the great legacy they represent, they've brought together the various groups, ideologies, geographies, communities that collectively make up the fabric of the Congress party. And one could argue that, except for the last two elections, they have a clear record of success and certainly of experience in leading the party, both when in government and during the tough times in the wilderness, where they've managed to rally the men and women of the Congress together. So we shouldn't forget the magnitude of what they've achieved for the party, and many people in the party are not prepared to overlook the ultimate sacrifice paid by two former presidents from the party. Now, at the same time, they've also cultivated a strong crop of dynamic leaders, both at the center and in the states. I mean, the Scindias and the pilots have risen under the Gandhis. No, I mean,
and they left,
both of them came into politics under Sonia Gandhi's presidency. So I would say that, no, like them, there are many others who have not left.
Somebody can accuse them, they were there because of the dynasty. Their father was there in the Congress, and therefore they were in the Congress. There was no other option. They didn't come from other parties. They were not grown. They didn't grow within the party. But I am saying, frankly speaking, do you see a future where the Congress president will be somebody else and not the Congress? Gandhi?
I think so. I mean, Rahul Gandhi insists that he does not want to be president. He has not retracted his letter of July last year. I think he is strongly willing to be a major voice and face for the party. But so far, he has said he doesn't want to be president. So I think that you could well imagine a situation where somebody else is president. But, you know, again, I don't know. At the moment, we have a Gandhi as president, though as an interim president.
We shall have a Gandhi as president as well.
No, I'm certainly looking forward to a resolution of this process. And undoubtedly, Prabhu, it would have happened by now, except for the lockdown and the coronavirus situation, because in the normal course, Sonia ji's term was to expire, I think, in August, early August, and the working committee would have taken some sort of decision by then. So I think it's very clear that the process leading up to a final decision as to how to go, which would have then had to culminate in an AICC meeting to ratify a president and all of that, that simply cannot happen in these circumstances. So we're looking at a very artificial process, an artificial period. And I think it's all the more unfortunate, actually, that the issues are being raised at a time when it's difficult to resolve them. I think in the course of normal politics, there would have been much more discussion amongst Congress people, with the Congress leadership and so on, and you would have seen something happening. But clearly, this has been an artificial period, Prabhu, and I don't think you can easily say that that this represents anything real for anybody's politics. I mean, I would say that, by the way, when you speak of dynasty, I can name a dozen BJP leaders who are also the sons and daughters of politicians. So this seems to be a cultural phenomenon in our country, and I don't think it's unique to the Congress party.
Only the dynasties are moving back to BJP, most of them, basically.
Listen, at least spare a thought for people like me who have neither an inheritance up on top nor anyone to pass it on to politically. So I am genuinely there as a professional, and Kaveri mentioned the All India Professionals Congress. I'm proud to say it's been growing. Yeah. It's the one part that I'm aware of that has actually been increasing its membership every single month this year, including in the lockdown period. So I'm very happy that we do have an appeal to certain thinking professionals who are not happy with certain directions.
Even Shashi, professionals are moving out now. You are throwing them out of the party.
No.
Sanjay, yeah.
Well, Sanjay had, as far as I'm aware, remained a member. He's been suspended by the parent Congress, which is unfortunate, but suspension is not the same as expulsion, which is what you're referring to. And I hope it doesn't come to that, because Sanjay is an absolutely true blue congressman who has fought for the party, but I think he showed poor judgment in some of his statements, and that's why the party has apparently taken action. But I would say that Sanjay will always have a place in articulating a Congress ideology once this particular episode is behind us.
Shashi, which brings me to the last point, which is this other great conversation starter about you. There are many, but that if you can be Rahul's Manmohan Singh.
I don't think Rahul needs a Manmohan Singh, to be frank. I honestly don't, because I think Sonia ji took an amazing decision, which the whole nation hailed as an act of sacrifice. But we all know the circumstances that may have played a part in making her take that decision. She had a certain set of constraints which clearly did not apply and do not apply to Rahul Gandhi. Rahul Gandhi is born and brought up here. Sonia ji was not. Rahul Gandhi is the son of an Indian father. I don't think anyone can question either his nationality or his patriotism. And you had, unfortunately, with Sonia ji, people kind of distracting the nation with statements about shaving their head and sitting in parliament, and others saying that, how can somebody not born of our soil lead the country, and all of this kind of talk. And that had created a certain atmosphere. And I think though Sonia ji was perfectly legally, constitutionally, morally, and politically justified in taking on the prime ministership, she decided she didn't want to be a distraction, and we should respect that judgment. The nation respected her for it. I think if you took any popularity poll before and after that decision, she would have gone up in people's esteem. In the case of Rahul Gandhi, none of these constraints exist. So I don't think he needs a Manmohan Singh, frankly. He speaks very, very effectively and unchallengeably as somebody with the right to speak for India and the right to speak for the Congress party. So, I mean, whether other leaders emerge in the Congress is certainly yet to be seen. But if Rahul Gandhi were to be reappointed in the leadership, I don't think that there can be any question that he needs somebody else to be an acceptable face. So now, there is a different argument. Yeah. There is a different argument, which is that Rahul Gandhi may well feel that the organizational task of running the party, as opposed to being the face of the party. So there could be an argument for a reversal of the Sonia ji Manmohan situation, where Sonia ji ran the organization and Manmohan Singh ji was the policy face of the government. You could, in the present situation, easily envisage an opposite situation where somebody with a lot of organizational experience and so on runs the party hierarchy, runs the party organization, takes the nuts and bolts decision as to who should be general secretary there and who should be doing something like that. And Rahul Gandhi continues to be the policy face of the party. So you can actually have a reversal. But it's not that he needs a Manmohan Singh in the sense that your question implied.
Could it be you, Shashi?
Look, I mean, when it comes to
No. Kaveri, I think this thing, Rahul Gandhi and Manmohan Singh, that was in context of the government.
Yeah.
You are talking in terms of party now.
Party. Why can't Shashi lead the party?
No. I'm just asking a question. What does it mean? That it means Rahul Gandhi should remain the president, face of the party, and somebody else should run the organization. Like Venugopal, that the person who was there already doing it. But
look,
that's not working. No?
You're asking me a question that, as the Americans like to say, is above my pay grade. I am in no position, no position to determine any of these. All I'm saying is that as the leadership, the high command, as we like to call them, comes to a conclusion, I'm sure all of these options are available. One option is indeed for the previous president to be reappointed president, that would be Rahul Gandhi, and to subsume both roles, leading the organization and being the policy face. A second policy would be for him to stay aside and say somebody else should do both of those things. A third policy could be that he says, no, I will be the policy face, I will articulate the party line, I will lead the party politically, but somebody else should be the party president, run the organization, and that could be somebody with a lot of organizational experience in the party, which clearly would not apply in my case. I mean, it all depends.
Basically, Shashi, if I conclude it that way, that you're recommending there has to be reform within the Congress party where the face and the person who actually runs day-to-day function, they have to be two different people.
No, I'm saying that is
reform
an option.
Internal democracy.
I'm saying it is an option. I'm not saying it's the only option or even the preferred option.
No, one of those
a lot
options.
Depends. No. As I said, you could have a full-time president who's prepared to do both. But if the person who is most likely to be elected by the party workers as the full-time president doesn't want both roles, then there are other options available. That's all I'm saying. Let me stress, Prabhu, let me stress one thing. First of all, that I'm talking aloud with you because you're asking questions aloud, but these are processes which are well established within the party. There is an AICC mechanism, there is a CWC mechanism, there is a high command. They will be making the decisions. So I don't see that there is a crisis in the party. But when I speak of reforming and reviving, I'm talking about very specific things. Reviving institutions within the party. Reviving by bringing in fresh faces and young people at various levels. District level, PCC level. Also, of course, in office bearers in various parts of the national apparatus. Then at the same time, I'm talking about reviving through inspiring people by our effective opposition to some of the misdeeds of the government and articulating a positive message. This nation needs
I
both
get your
opposition
point.
and
Let me
positive.
now, because now you are a politician, but you are arguing like a diplomat. No? You say nothing at the end of it. But let me,
I'm not saying nothing, I mean everything.
uncharitable, I can't figure out what you said. Ultimately, I want to be very specific. You mean to say that the time has come where Gandhis alone cannot deliver. They need the assistance of some people who know the subject, who know the organization, who know the nuts and bolts. Are you saying that?
I think the Gandhis would say to you that they've never claimed to have delivered alone.
High command was only Gandhi. You want expansion of high command. You need the expanded high command.
Listen, the high command is not just the Gandhis, it's also the leaders around them and the working committee of the Congress. So the high command is a large entity. Listen, don't get me into an unnecessary quarrel with you and with others. All I'm saying, I have said very clearly, as far as I'm concerned,
I'm asking as a journalist.
the Gandhis themselves, I think, have brought up a number of talented, capable, able leaders who have been able to offer strong leadership and work tirelessly and effectively to take the Congress party forward. So they themselves will tell you, we didn't do it alone, we're doing it together, and the party should be a party of people working together. That is my message. Main nahi hum.
Which hum you don't know. They are also hum, not two of them.
Three of them.
Three of them, okay. Yeah. Sorry.
I think that was quite an interesting discussion, and I hope Shashi doesn't go down in history as the best president the Congress never had. So thank you very much, Shashi. Thank you so much, Prabhu. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Shashi. Thank you.
All the best.
All the best. Take care, both of you.